good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming along. So this paper really relates to some work we've been doing in the Ministry of Planning and Development in Mozambique on social programs. So let me get to it. As we all know, doing social policy is inherently suboptimal. So we can never design a perfect program. And within this, we have this long-standing debate over universal versus targeted programs. And I think you'll agree that this is often framed as largely a binary choice. It's either universal or we target. The critique of targeting are well known, and they are often revolve around concerns about the political fragility of targeting and the poor performance of various targeting methods. We often hear about leakage and targeting errors in the region of 30 to 40%. Nonetheless, I think we do find ourselves confronted with what might be at least a weak consensus that targeting is in some ways inevitable, cost-effective, and with technology increasingly feasible across developing countries, and I suspect we'll probably hear that in tomorrow's annual lecture. So a lot of the recent literature has taken up the question, how best to target? So what are the best targeting technologies in different contexts? At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that many large-scale social programs are built fairly gradually, broadening access and adjusting eligibility over time. So as funding grows, as capability of the state increases, these programs expand. We saw that even with Bolsa Familia, one of the more famous ones, was actually built out of 4 separate programs that were originally established in Brazil. And as programs consolidate, a relevant policy issue, and at least I would say it's relevant for Mozambique, is when to invest in improved targeting as opposed to just scaling up coverage. Should we be focusing on getting the right people into the program or just increasing the number of people that we're covering? So I want to look at 2 main questions. One, when does scaling up program coverage, welfare dominate improvements in targeting under imperfect and costly information? So we're going to assume that it's very difficult to get perfect information about people who are eligible or non-eligible, and that's going to be a costly thing to achieve. And then I want to look at how do these trade-offs play out empirically in the case of Mozambique. So I'm going to leave you with 2 takeaways. First of all, we can use a very simple proxy or a practical metric to assess how much more effort to devote to targeting. And that will actually be based on 2 proxies for targeting success versus eligibility coverage, which is going to be something like your poverty rate, if you're targeting the poor, versus your current quota. So if the poverty rate, if you're targeting the poor, is far higher than the number of people you're actually covering, it's a pretty good rule to scale up coverage. If it's the inverse, focus on targeting. So the corollary of that is that one-size-fits-all targeting is probably not particularly optimal, at least in countries where you have a great deal of heterogeneity in spatial poverty. Urban areas, lower poverty; rural areas, higher poverty. Should we be using the same targeting technology? Probably not. Okay, so there's an analytical framework. I haven't really got time to take you through it, but what I want to maybe just look at very briefly is that this expression for the probability of being a beneficiary can be expressed in 2 complementary ways. So we can look at it in terms of the probability, a weighted share of those who are eligible and knowledgeable, and then in a slightly different way, but with a slightly different restatement, effectively. But what that gives us is effectively 2 equations and 3 unknowns. So our unknowns are the alphas, the lambdas, and the gammas here, and we're going to assume we know Q, which is the share of people covered currently, the share of beneficiaries in the population. So how many people are we covering? The government tends to know roughly how many people it's covering of a total population. And it also tends to know roughly what the theoretical poverty rate is. I mean, I'm saying poverty here as a shorthand for those people who are theoretically eligible. So it tends to know who it's covering, roughly what the poverty rate is, but it doesn't know these other things, which are things like the share of beneficiaries which are truly eligible, or the share of the eligible which are actually beneficiaries, because of that imperfect information. However, based on those equations, it turns out that the ratio of these two unknowns, which is the targeting success rate to the eligibility coverage rate, is just a ratio of two knowns, the poverty rate to the quota. This seems all very esoteric and potentially irrelevant, but this is useful because it allows us to do two things. First of all, it allows us to bound the eligibility and the coverage rates. So these unknown things can be bounded fairly, the bounds can be quite wide, but we know what the bounds are. And something that other people have noted previously, but is poorly acknowledged in the literature, is that a neutral lower bound for your targeting success rate is just your poverty rate. What does that mean? If I effectively go into a certain area and I randomly allocate a social program, okay, I'm effectively going to achieve Q star, the poverty rate in terms of my success, my targeting success rate. So that's the share of beneficiaries who are eligible. Equally, the lower bound for your eligibility coverage rate is just your quota. So these turn out to be quite useful things that we don't actually necessarily know, but we can approximate from things we do know. This turns out to be helpful because if we're looking at some form of a welfare metric, we can then use those to effectively bound our welfare metric, not our welfare metric, but the thing we want to look in our optimization. So if we're a policymaker, an operational welfare metric is likely to be the share of the population who are both eligible and selected as beneficiaries. So we want to maximize the share of the population who are, I only got 5 minutes, that was quick, who are both eligible and selected as beneficiaries, right? So that's our Z. So the technical rate of substitution, which I'm going to call the relative effectiveness as expanding program coverage, RES, is just this ratio alpha over Q. And as I said before, under non-adverse targeting, so as long as it's no worse than a lottery, the lower bound tightens to Q star Q. So the relative effectiveness, if we consider about this welfare metric, which I think is broadly plausible, is going to be a lower bound on that metric is Q star Q. So the ratio of your poverty rate to your quota. Now there's other stuff, but I haven't got more time, that we can also kind of expand this into effectively putting a kind of a price on effort. And the important thing to take away from this is that there's going to potentially be a significant domain where effort X, so this is targeting effort X, could be 0. So there could be optimal to place no effort into targeting, assuming a lower bound on alpha is Q star. So as long as we can achieve Q star, which is random allocation, there might be a domain in which no further effort is optimal in targeting because we're just simply not covering enough people. Now, of course, many of those coming from more advanced countries are going to think, even middle-income countries, this is not plausible, right? But in a country like Mozambique, this is a highly plausible situation. You've got areas with huge numbers of poor people and very low coverage of existing programs. So I'm going to pass through the numerical examples. I'm going to go to the Mozambique case. So what we look at here is this RES measure, this relative effectiveness of scale-up, as a very simple proxy. And what we find is that in some areas you've got a relative effective scale-up of 1.95. So there's large numbers of people who are theoretically eligible who aren't being covered, but you've got in some areas the complete opposite. Way more people are being covered than are theoretically eligible. So the argument here that I just really is trying to bring out, which is an extremely elaborate way of saying, guys, let's be serious. If we want to improve Mozambique's social protection system, we should probably be focusing on these areas where we've got very poor coverage and not waste a lot more money and time in trying to improve targeting in those areas. Why? Because poverty is already at 60% in some of these locations. And you can't really do better targeting than about 60, 70%. This is a map. This is this RES measure. This is the cumulative distribution function of this relative effectiveness of scale-up metric. And we find, using this neutral measure, around 60% of the population live in locations where the relative effectiveness of scale-up is likely to be greater than 1. So there's a lot of locations where simply expanding coverage seems to be a great idea compared to putting more money, investment, and that means resources into improving the targeting effectively. However, of course, there are areas which are, frankly, the urban areas in the south where improvements in targeting would make sense. So this is a map of this relative effectiveness of scale-up metric, which is something we have from data. If we know how many poor there are, if we know what the quota is, down to this is the administrative post. There's about 460 of these. We can map very clearly where it looks sensible to be scaling up and where it might look sensible in the future, perhaps, to invest a bit more in terms of improving your targeting. This is a metric where this finally is just if we calibrate this measure with X in how much effort should you put into targeting, similar to this RES measure, we get a whole bunch of locations where actually 0 is the optimal outcome. So that's saying there are a lot of locations in Mozambique where it probably makes no sense at all to be putting money into targeting because poverty rates are so high, effectively. That's the argument. This is that. There's some welfare metrics here that also say the same thing. I'll leave you with what I think is perhaps an important point, is that if we're interested in a robust social protection system, I have 0 minutes, then I think we need to think about 3 elements. One is appropriate program quotas based on granular population and poverty data. So let's take geographic targeting in that sense very seriously. That's where we do have data and we can do something. Use simple exclusion rules to ensure non-regressive targeting where Q star is high. So just ensure that we can at least make sure that we're not prioritizing the non-poor, which in itself actually is important. And finally, shift to more costly targeting in low poverty locations. So probably a dual approach. And I'll leave it there. So apologies for the rapid tour through this, but thank you for your attention.